Donald Trump has just scored his biggest win in international politics. And we're not talking about some minor issue. What was at stake was the most important trade deal of the moment, the new rules of the game between the United States and Europe. Well, in this match, Trump didn't just win, he steamrolled. He crushed it, humiliated, bulldozed Brussels without mercy. Trump got absolutely everything he wanted, and Europe gave in on every front. But that's not all. Ursula von der Leyen herself came out and said Trump is a great leader, that he's tough, constructive, even fair.
You're known as a tough negotiator and deal maker.
But
what is in front? And fair.
Things were off to a very bad start from the very beginning. The president of the European Commission had to ask for a meeting with Trump during one of his spare moments, while he was playing golf at one of his properties in Scotland. And yes, apparently, she had to wait until he finished his game. Brutal. In any case, the real question is, what exactly does this new agreement between the United States and the European Union mean? What does each side gain and lose? And how is this going to impact the markets and the economies of both players? Well, that's exactly what we're going to break down in this new video on Visualeconomik. We're going to answer all of these questions one by one. But before we dive in, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the perfect time. It only takes a second. Just click and you're done. That way, you'll stay up to date with everything we publish. I'm telling you this because most of you who watch our videos aren't subscribed yet. So what do you say? Are you in? Go ahead. Click. Alright, with that out the way, let's jump into the first question. What the hell did the United States and the European Union actually agree on? Well, listen up. In the press, on the radio, and on TV, you're going to hear that a new trade agreement has been reached. Well, that's a lie. What actually happened was a clear and overwhelming victory for Trump. We'll get into how all of this benefits or hurts the US economy in a moment. By the way, you'll also hear a bunch of liberals celebrating this whole situation. Wild, but we'll save that topic for another day. And yes, you'll probably also hear von der Leyen herself claiming it was a success, that they reached an agreement. Sorry, Madam President of the Commission, but you didn't achieve a damn thing. The point is, there's one thing we all need to be absolutely clear about. This is exactly what Trump wanted, and he got pretty much everything he set out to get, including, as we mentioned earlier, a huge political win. Just look at how euphoric he and his team were. So what's this agreement all about? Or rather, this imposition. Now, it's true, there are still some details that haven't been made public or fully clarified, but broadly speaking, here's what we know. First off, the United States will impose a universal tariff of 15% on nearly all imports coming from Europe, with the exception of aluminium and steel, which will remain at 50%, though it looks like there will be quotas at lower rates. They'll also set zero tariffs on certain strategic products like aircraft parts and engines, some chemicals, and specific semiconductor equipment, along with a few other exceptions, including raw materials. Basically, to put it simply, everything the US considers essential to keep its economic engine running. Now, keep in mind, before the Trump era, the average tariff on imports from Europe was just 1.6%. That's now set to go up by as much as tenfold. And here's the kicker. Cars and pharmaceuticals, two of Europe's biggest export sectors, will also be hit with that 15% tariff, at least for now, because Trump has already made it clear that the pharmaceutical industry is next in its crosshairs. In fact, a Department of Commerce investigation is already underway, the same move he used to raise tariffs on steel and aluminium in the past. These are these so-called Section 232 tariffs, and with this agreement, the European Union is basically legitimizing them. A serious mistake, according to many experts, which Brussels could end up paying dearly for. Although, to be fair, von der Leyen insists she got a commitment that these tariffs won't be raised further for European companies. We'll see. So that's the US side of things. Now, on the European side, the EU has agreed to drop tariffs to 0% on US products. Yeah, so much for Trump's reciprocal tariffs idea. Seems like that's history now. Turns out reciprocity doesn't suit them anymore.
President Trump just unlocked one of the biggest economies in the world. The European Union is going to open its $20 trillion market and completely accept our auto and industrial standards for the first time ever.
But hold on, because that's not all. The European Union has also agreed to reduce non-tariff barriers. It's committed to having its member states spend a lot more, a whole lot more, on weapons made in the United States. And it has pledged to ramp up purchases of oil, liquefied natural gas, and other types of energy from the US, essentially replacing replacing almost all remaining imports that still come from Russia. The total bill? Around $750 billion over the next 3 years, according to none other than Lady Defeat herself. And if that actually happens, it's a massive deal. Just so you get a sense of the scale, in 2024, EU energy imports from the US were under $100 billion, and in total, the EU imported about $375 billion worth of energy products from around the world that year, would mean the EU becoming hugely dependent on the United States for its energy needs. And yep, we're still not done. It looks like Brussels has also promised not to poke the American tech giants in the eye, at least not more than strictly necessary. On top of that, they've announced plans to promote $600 billion in investment inside the United States, though honestly that probably amounts to little more than fluff. Just a way to make Trump's win look even bigger. A president who, let's hear it again, was called fair by von der Leyen, despite the clearly lopsided nature of the commitments she just signed up to.
You're known as a tough negotiator and deal maker.
But
what is in front? And fair.
If you're asking for our take on this within the team, here's what we'd say. This isn't really a deal, it's more like a bloodletting. Because look, at the same time Europe agrees to higher tariffs on its exports, it's throwing its doors wide open to American products, which, don't get me wrong, sounds fine until you realise they're giving in without getting anything in return. And on top of that, they're agreeing to structurally higher production costs by committing to buy American energy. And that's not all. They're basically admitting they've been taking advantage of Uncle Sam. They're backing Trump's narrative. They're agreeing to foot more of Ukraine's bill. And on top of it all, they're pledging to send even more money to the US, which of course will be paid for with more debt and higher taxes. In other words, this whole package is completely one-sided, no matter how much Lady Defeat tries to spin it by saying things like this.
The agreement reached today brings certainty in uncertain times for citizens and businesses on both sides of the Atlantic.
Which of course she could have said just as confidently if the tariff had been 20%, 30%, or even 50%. And seriously, come on. If there's one thing Trump is known for, it's that his deals barely last more than a news cycle. So no, we're not better off. We're worse off. And the uncertainty, nowhere near gone. It'll be back, without a doubt, and probably sooner than we think. You know what? There was one moment in that joint press conference that was especially humiliating. It happened when a journalist asked the president of the European Commission what exactly the United States had given up in this deal, what concessions it had made, what Europe had actually gotten out of all this. Her answer, well, see for yourselves.
So the starting point was an imbalance, a surplus on our side and a deficit on the US side. And we wanted to rebalance the trade relation.
I mean, it's no surprise so many people have called it downright pathetic. Wait, so her starting point, her goal, was to punish European companies. That was the mission? She talks about the trade deficit, but what about the capital account deficit Europe has with the United States? Why is so much European savings being funneled into financing the US economy? Doesn't that seem like a problem? Well, for the record, we don't see an issue there, but we also don't see one with a trade deficit. And if she's concerned about one side of the story, she should really be looking at the other too. Besides, it's simply not true. This entire narrative is built on a big lie. Because when people talk about the trade deficit in goods, they conveniently leave out two massive pieces of the puzzle: the services balance and the profits American companies make in Europe. And when you factor those in, the whole picture changes. In fact, in many recent years, the US has actually run a current account surplus, specifically between 2007 and 2019. That's no small thing. So yeah, as you can see, the real story is completely different from the one they're trying to sell us. But hey, von der Leyen just keeps doing her thing, totally unbothered. In fact, this is how she wrapped up her big negotiation. With this photo to mark the occasion and with this heartfelt thank you.
I want to thank President Trump personally for his personal commitment and leadership to achieve this breakthrough.
And let me be blunt here. Under normal circumstances, from a political standpoint, this would probably call for nothing less than her immediate resignation. But instead, we see her smiling like everything's great. And honestly, what can I say? It just seems to confirm that Brussels either has no clue what's going on, or simply doesn't want to know. Whatever the case, They must have their reasons. Either way, her words make one thing crystal clear. She didn't get a single thing out of this deal. Which brings us to the next big question. Who actually wins from all of this? And look, it's only fair to say, not everything about this is bad. Not even for Europe. You might read somewhere that the big winners here are Europe's car manufacturers, that the EU chose to sacrifice everything else just to protect them. Well, that's not true. It's false. A 15% tariff is going to hurt them badly. Sure, it's not as brutal as a 27.5% tariff, but still, their path ahead is anything but smooth. At best, they'll survive. These are companies already facing growing challenges, and their future is increasingly uncertain, so no, that's not a win. And no matter what spin you hear, this is not a deal Brussels can feel good about. Saying otherwise is pure PR, nothing more. That said, let's not blow things out of proportion either. From a political perspective, the agreement is a disaster, but from an economic standpoint, the impact is more contained. At the end of the day, EU exports of goods to the US make up about 2.7% of the bloc's GDP, which is nothing, but it's also not catastrophic. Trade will continue and businesses will adapt. Many will lose sales, many will see profits squeezed and struggle, but the European economy is huge, and most trade and production will keep going. Still, in the grand scheme of things, there are three clear winners in all of this. First, no doubt about it, Donald Trump. Just look at the celebrations coming out of the White House. And for good reason. This is a massive political win. Because, let's remember, the European Union was really the only bloc with the size and leverage to push back against the US. But now, with Brussels completely folded, the rest of the world will have little choice but to follow suit. In fact, that's already happening. As the Financial Times pointed out, describing this deal as a total capitulation, Europe actually abandoned China and Canada when those countries tried to stand up to Trump and push back.
Rather than join Canada and China with instant retaliation and inflict pain on US consumers and businesses, the EU, hamstrung by divergent views among its member states, chose to take the pain in the hope of securing a better deal.
Well, Brussels didn't pull it off. Instead, the European Commission's lack of response ended up forcing other countries, like Japan, to cave in too, just like they did.
The EU would have been better off answering the US vigorously in April in a 1-2 combo with China's retaliation against the US tariff hikes, which left markets and Trump reeling.
The problem is that, on one hand, the Commission didn't have the courage to play hardball. They basically trusted that Trump would eventually be more reasonable, which clearly didn't happen. And on top of that, several member states pushed hard for a friendly deal to protect specific products with strong political backing. And guess what? Now all of those are going to get hit. And it doesn't even stop there. Washington also played a more political kind of blackmail. We're talking about threats to cut aid to Ukraine, pull US troops out of Europe, and even abandon NATO altogether. Of course, none of this would have been the end of the world. Trump would have had a hard time justifying such drastic moves. And let's not forget, Europe had plenty of leverage to push back. Energy, capital flows, tariffs, China. There were lots of tools on the table. They just didn't know how to use them. They never had the nerve or the strength to do it. So, in the end, Trump steamrolled them, and honestly, he probably walked away with more than he even expected to get in the first place. So yeah, this time we can say that Trump played like a top-tier negotiator, art of the deal. In fact, get this. He pulled a last-minute move on Europe. How? Well, his team had actually reached a deal. Reciprocal tariffs at 10% seemed fair enough. But then, in a move straight out of the madman theory, the same one Nixon used, and which Soviet submarines called the Crazy Ivan tactic, Trump suddenly refused to accept what his own team had negotiated and agreed to with the Europeans. Instead, he threw out a new proposal, a universal 30% tariff that completely threw Brussels off balance. So yeah, this time, Trump really did know how to negotiate. And the result? A total victory. Now, over at the European Commission, they're trying to spin this as a win for consumers, saying it'll give them access to more products at better prices, and for companies too, because it'll force them to be more competitive. In fact, the president herself said this.
We will give better access for American products to our market. This will benefit European consumers and make our businesses more competitive.
And sure, that could theoretically be true, but if she really believes in that idea, why not push for a universal zero tariff policy for everyone? I'll just leave that question hanging. Now, moving on to something far more relevant. We've got a whole bunch of American companies that are about to gain completely unrestricted access to a market of over 450 million consumers. And yes, some of you might be thinking, and rightly so, hold on Josh, the 15% tariff also hurts them. They have to pay more for machinery, for example. And yes, but also no. Let me explain. That might be true, especially if Trump offsets those extra costs with tax cuts at home. In that case, it means that Europe, and really the rest of the world too, ends up helping finance those tax breaks. Because yes, it's true, tariffs are mostly paid by American companies and consumers, but it's also true that part of that cost is absorbed by exporters, who are often forced to lower their prices just to stay competitive. Either way, in the short term, this is all great news for the S&P 500. On one hand, American companies are gaining freer access to big markets. On the other, they're facing less competition at home. And on top of that, they are hopeful that tax cuts will at least partially offset the cost of tariffs. Plus, the agreement removes the threat of a full-blown trade war, something that had markets seriously spooked. And let's not forget, reducing both the trade and fiscal deficits is generally good for the US dollar, which until now has been hemorrhaging investor confidence this year. The result, futures surged into the green the moment the deal was announced, and no doubt a lot of investors went to bed smiling that night. And yes, naturally for American energy and defense companies, this deal is a jackpot. It's going to rain money on them. Energy firms, they're basically kicking Russia out of the gas and oil game in Europe, at least for the foreseeable future. Defense contractors, they're cashing in on the massive rearmament packages European governments are rushing through. And then there's another group of companies that stand to win big: US foundries and chip makers. Why? Because the agreement specifically includes language giving their equipment a bigger role in the EU, supposedly for security reasons. And this, in fact, is what led many analysts to conclude that this deal massively increases Europe's dependence on the US for both energy and technology, which, yeah, that's huge. Those are two big winners, but we said there were three. And the third might just be political parties, often more nationalist, sometimes more extreme, or simply more aligned with Donald Trump's worldview. Because at the end of the day, this whole story will likely earn them a wave of new support, even within Europe itself. But hang on. We're not just talking about winners here, because even for the US, this deal isn't all sunshine and roses, which brings us to the next question. What are the biggest looming risks for both the United States and for Europe in this so-called deal? Let's take a look. On the US side, tariffs might feel like a win in the short term, but in the long run, they are a problem. They weaken consumers' purchasing power, push prices higher, and make many American companies less globally competitive. And here's another key point. If the trade deficit goes down, so will the inflow of capital used to finance America's financial muscle. And since Americans aren't exactly known for being big savers, that could shrink the pool of funding available for companies, startups, and new ventures. In the long run, that could mean slower economic growth for Uncle Sam. And here's the thing, some of this is already happening. Take a look at this chart from a recent Harvard study. You can clearly see how prices of imported goods are already starting to rise faster than those of domestic goods. In other words, prices are going up. The effects are kicking in. Right now, the overall level of US tariffs is the highest it's been since the 1930s, roughly 6 times higher than it was when Trump first took office. And don't be fooled, according to the latest estimates, between 80% and 90% of the cost of those tariffs is being absorbed by US consumers and businesses. It's essentially a hidden tax hike. Now, according to Bloomberg Economics, the global impact of all this could be around $2 trillion in losses, and naturally, a large chunk of that cost would fall on the US economy itself. Although, given how little resistance the rest of the world has put up, who knows? Maybe the actual cost will end up being much lower than expected. Still, headlines like this are already starting to pop up.
Trump's tariffs are being picked up by corporate America. GM profit shrinks after $1.1 billion tariff hit.
Tariffs are already taking a serious bite out of the profits of many major US multinationals. But even so, this time, the United States might not be the biggest loser. Europe could be hit harder. No, it won't be a full-blown tragedy. The estimates say these tariffs might shave off tens of billions from the EU's GDP. But with a 20 trillion euro economy, the impact will still be relatively limited. What's worse, though, is that many companies will continue losing competitiveness. competitiveness. That could slow down the recovery of economies like Germany's, which is still struggling to get back on its feet. And all of this comes as the EU's political strength and credibility takes a serious hit. Because let's be honest, they've come out of this looking really bad. And of course, all of this leaves us with a lot of unanswered questions. Take climate policy, for example. The US is scaling back on environmental regulations that raise costs for businesses. Meanwhile, the EU is going in the opposite direction. Look at what's happening in Estonia. More than 50% of the country's electricity comes from shale oil, a technology that's no longer competitive because of how much it has to pay in emissions credits. As you can imagine, this is costing them a fortune and putting enormous pressure on local industry. And that's just one example. There are thousands more like it across Europe. Trump, of course, wants nothing to do with this. So the big question now is, if this deal makes European companies even less competitive, what's the European Commission going to do about it? And that's a real problem. But perhaps the biggest concern is that this move is fueling a global surge in protectionism. Think about it. If people see that the US is getting away with this and actually benefiting from it, why wouldn't other countries follow suit? And in the long run, that could lead to a sharp rise in protectionist policies around the world, which of course is terrible news for the global economy. On top of that, by framing this agreement as a political victory for Trump and praising his supposed negotiating brilliance, it's going to be much harder for the US to walk any of this back in the near future. In other words, we're now a whole lot closer to a new protectionist era, and that, without a doubt, is bad news. Friends, that's where things stand. Like it or not, this has clearly been a win for Trump. And truth be told, for the US, it comes with downsides, but also quite a few upsides. Honestly, it's not even clear that this is a net negative for them, even if those massive military and energy purchase numbers end up being greatly exaggerated. But that's something only time will tell. In the meantime, we want to hear from you. What do you think about this agreement? Let us know your thoughts in the comments and let's get the debate going. Don't forget to give this video a like if you found it interesting. And of course, subscribe if you haven't already. Take care. I'll see you next time.